Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree, and I'm doing another video game buyer's guide, collector's guide. And this time, we're talking about the Sega Game Gear. Now listen, I love Sega to death. You know this. I talk about them all the damn time. And you know the Genesis is one of the greatest game consoles ever made. It's one of my favorite game consoles. And the Game Gear is supposed to be sort of like a portable Genesis. Sort of. Actually, it was more accurately like a portable Sega Master System. But nobody bought the Master System, nor did they know what the fuck it was. So we just go with portable Genesis, even though it's essentially a Master System in handheld form. But we love the Game Gear, right? Well, that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about who's the Game Gear for, and what do you need to know before you dive into collecting. The first thing you need to know is the machine itself is heavy, and it's going to suck the life out of your batteries, so be prepared to invest heavily in, Rayovac or Duracell or whoever's making batteries. Does Everready still exist? Batteries? Anyways. Yeah, you gotta have a big shoebox full of AA batteries to use this thing. I'm sorry. The games are not great, but there's some hidden gems in there. There's some okay, decent stuff. More or less, you're gonna find essentially the same games, almost identical to the games you saw on the Game Boy around that same time, as well as ports from the Master System, and a few games that are trying to be spin-offs and related to the relatives to the Genesis counterparts. But not a ton of original games, and I hate to say this, not a single killer app like Game Boy had Tetris and Super Mario Land. No killer app on the Game Gear, unfortunately. Collecting the machine, there's not a lot of variety. They didn't make it long enough. It didn't sell well enough for there to be too many revisions. And there's not a ton of units out there, so they're going to be a little bit on the pricey side. Games, again, not that great. They're not too super expensive, but they're also not easy to find. And when you do find them, you're not going to find much value in them. As far as retro clones, I don't know if there's any retro clones that can play Game Gear games. I would assume not. Emulation is okay. It's a way to go, but Game Gear emulation is not perfect, unfortunately, and I don't know why. But there are games that don't work with your popular emulators for some reason. And so that can be a bummer. And that's about it. Sega has released a handful of Game Gear games digitally over the years in various Genesis collections and Sonic the Hedgehog collections, but they're usually like unlockables that you have to beat other games in order to get, so they're sort of like a bonus feature, hidden DLC, I guess, if you will, but they're not great games to begin with, so there's not really any reason to go out of your way to unlock them. Who's it for? Well, I would say your diehard Sega fans, obviously, and your completist that has to own everything. But I would also argue that there's room in your collection for a Game Gear if you happen to be a handheld gamer, game collector. If you love the Game Boy and you love the Game Boy Advance and the DS, and you thought the Lynx might be cool or the Turbo Express, you probably want to get a Game Gear. It's better than most systems. In terms of like features and hardware and etc., it's much better than the Game Boy. As far as software library goes, the Game Boy's got it beat by a fucking 10-mile stretch, unfortunately. But there are still some good, legit games on the Game Gear, if you will. They're just basically colorized versions of Game Boy games, or they're just scaled down versions of Genesis games, or they're just straight up ports of the Master System. We'll talk Nomad later. The other thing you have to know is there is, I believe, an adapter that lets you play Master System games on your Game Gear. There are some fun collectible items and neat little gadgets, like the TV tuner and some stuff like that. So it can be a fun system to collect for. The TV tuner, unfortunately, doesn't work anymore if you live in the U.S. because we no longer have NTSC broadcasts. So the only way you can use the TV tuner is if it has a coax input, which I don't think it does. You'd have to have a digital converter, or you have to find some way to have a digital converter box that can pick up the ATSC signal and then locally rebroadcast it over an NTSC frequency, which I don't think that technology exists, although it probably should. Anyways, that's all I got to say about the Game Gear. Happy hunting. Stay cool.